share with you some of the research findings that I've extracted from historical records relative to the Africans who were on St. Croix after the abolition of the Danish slave trade at the end of 1802. We know relatively little beyond 1802 or 1803 about this particular ethnic group. We have some records that go back into the 18th century that give us some inkling about their composition at the time of the ending of the slave trade. We know that approximately 50,000 enslaved people, or captive people really, kidnapped people, were brought into St. Croix from Africa via the Danish transatlantic slave trade between 1734 and 1803. About 12,000 of those people arrived in the last decade of the Danish slave trade. That is from 1792 to 1802. They were brought in large numbers, more than on average, because everybody knew the slave trade was ending, and people were literally trying to stock up on their labor force by purchasing individuals from the slave trade. And so this was a time of great commercial activity for the slave owners and the slave traders, but a time of great distress and horror for the enslaved people who were being brought here. We have relatively little information about Africans, despite the fact that they were an important contributor to the history and the development of St. Croix. When I say Africans, I'm talking here about ethnic Africans, people who were born in Africa and brought here by the slave trade. The first documentation relating to them as a specific group occurs in 1792, when Peter Oxholm did a census, a plantation census, in which he identified both Africans and Creoles who were distributed on St. Croix. And from that, we have our first information about the number of Africans actually on St. Croix at a particular date and where they were. And we see from the image up there that we can see that there were 8,397 Africans, the census that Oxholm made, and they comprised 46% of the enslaved population. And I'm trying to see what this is. 34% of the total population. As I said, between 1792 and 1803, 12,000 individuals were brought onto the island forcibly and sold here. And yet, at the end of that period, the number of Africans on St. Croix was only about 2,000 more than 10 years earlier. So what that tells us already is that there's a high rate of mortality among Africans, and particularly among the new Africans who were being brought by the slave trade. And at the same time, they increased their percentage of the total population, of the enslaved population, but their number was still less than 50%. And I will just, as a point of fact, note that Africans never comprised a large part, a major part of our population, enslaved population here. Probably 50 to 60% was maximum. And that was because the slave trade really never got going on St. Croix until the 1740s, or really the 1750s. And island was populated primarily by people from other Caribbean islands who were brought here, who came here as planters and brought their slaves with them. And many of those individuals who came were Creoles. So the mix between African and Creoles was, at the beginning of colonization here, pretty even compared to other places where Africans would have predominated as the founding mothers and fathers of the black population. In 1804, at the end of the slave trade, the Danes did another census. And we have the figures there, but Betsy, if you could scroll down or scroll to the next image.
You want to pass this map?
Yeah, we can see the map. And I apologize for the quality of this map. Half of it's not here. But, oops, we lost it. Can we get back down, Betsy? You can use these. No, there's not. Just go down. There. What this map shows, the red or the reddish and orangish colors are the highest concentrations of the distribution, showing the distribution of enslaved Africans on St. Croix. And you can see from this map that they were most heavily concentrated in the center part of the island and running up to the North Shore. Places like Bethlehem, Castleburg, I'm trying to think this over here, it's right here rather, it's Rust Up Twist and other places, Spring Garden, Annalee, and so on. Those were places of high concentrations of Africans at the end of the Danish slave trade. In 1850, another census was made by Oxholm, and you can see by that time the enslaved African population, or the African population, had declined by about 20% over the previous decade. And the number of their percentage of the slave population had dwindled to about a third from about a half. And then the next piece of information we have about the number of enslaved Africans on St. Croix is the census made in 1841. But before discussing that, which will be the main focus of my presentation, I just want to tell you a little bit about the sources of information we have that relate to the enslaved Africans on St. Croix. We have a great number of records that identify Africans as Africans. This is a problem for those of us who are doing research, that we get a lot of information about enslaved individuals, but we don't always get information about their ethnicity. And therefore, tracking Africans is somewhat of a challenge. And for those people who are interested in Africans as their ancestor, it is a challenge. And the period between 1803 and about 1841 is a particularly difficult period, because a lot of the records that we usually use are not so readily available for that period. But these are the records that give us information about people who were Africans and identify them as Africans. Shipping records, and we have a great deal of those. My colleague, Dr. Sven Holso, has been collecting that information for about 25 years now. He has most of the shipping records and the names of the people who came off the ships. So we're probably talking about something like 20 to 30,000 individuals who are either identified by name or at least as a purchase, I will say. We have mortgage records, because many of the individuals who were purchased off the slave ships were mortgaged, and therefore they were identified and actually given a value. We have auction records, again, partially because the enslaved individuals were being auctioned, and partially because enslaved individuals were sold and were identified as Africans in the transactions. We have royal loan records. The Danish government set up a loan program to help finance the importation of enslaved Africans to St. Croix during the last decade. And many planters borrowed money from that loan program, but they had to identify the names of the people who they were borrowing money on. And then in 1802, they had to do an accounting of their status as of that time when the slave trade ended. And those records, while not complete for the entire set of people who came, the 12,000, nonetheless give us a very good amount of information about the arrivals during that last decade and their locations. We have head tax lists. Starting in 1772, slaves on St. Croix were taxed, and they were identified in tax lists. They were taxed before 1772, but from 1772 on, the Danes made people prepare head tax lists to show who was on their property for whom they were paying taxes. And these are plantation or town property censuses, literally, that cover the entire island. Those do not identify Africans until the 1790s, really not until the 1800s. And we have from them, from between 1800 and about 1818, Africans being identified as such in the slave list. But it's possible, once you identify those individuals, to track them back in the slave list, to see them all the way back to the 1770s, because they had been there as long as those lists were being prepared in some cases. We have plantation inventories and property inventories, and because enslaved people were property, they were listed. We have runaway notices, in which Africans were identified not only by name and by location, but by their physical characteristics, their dress, their height, and so on. We have, as Joel well knows, royal slave records of the enslaved people who worked on this site, who belonged to the king, and was the largest cohort of Africans in Christiansted. And those records were meticulously kept because they were the king's property. We have free colored records in which the handful of Africans who became free are recognized and identified. We have pension records, people who in the 1820s and 30s began to apply for pensions or charity because they were destitute and could not take care of themselves. And several of those individuals were identified as Africans. We have church records, vital statistic records, which identify Africans being baptized, being married, and dying. We have police court records, and police and court records, I should say, which identify individuals who are involved in criminal matters. And those identify people as Africans, and they are very, very rich. And those of you who came to the lecture I did on WIM about a woman by the name of Venus Johannes, who we can track from a river in Senegal to Frederiksted, and then follow her family line all the way up to people who are alive today. That information was found in a police document or in a court case, and therefore these are important records because they give a lot more information about individuals beyond their names and locations. And finally, we have the censuses, and the censuses start. The first census was done here in 1835. Unfortunately, we only have a few of those records remaining. But the first complete census was done in 1841. And that's the one I'm going to discuss in a minute. I would like to say, however, for those of you who are using census records, that I have found in this research that we've got to be very careful about people who are being identified as Africans. I have gone through those census records very meticulously over the last month or so, and I have found and confirmed about 300 people, nearly 300 people, who are identified as being born on St. Croix or in the West Indies, but who are definitely Africans. So there are more Africans in that census than we know of. At the same time, I've identified about 85 to 100 individuals who are listed as Africans who in fact could be shown to be born on St. Croix or elsewhere in the Caribbean. So there's problems. Even though you find an African in the census, it's a problem. You've got to really make sure you can check that against other census records to confirm that that person is actually an African. But what you can do in the censuses, once you get them all together, is create, there were 11 censuses done by the Danes between 1835 and 1911. And you can follow those individuals by census every 5 years for the first 6 censuses, I believe, and then every 10 years for the last of the censuses. And you can see that what their characteristics are, and I'm going to talk about what the social characteristics of Africans on St. Croix were in 1845 or 41 using the census of that year. Could we have the next slide? So this is a profile of the Africans on St. Croix in 1841. And I'm just going to read what you see on the screen, but I'm going to let you sort of digest that information too. There were 2,120 Africans on St. Croix. They comprised just 8% of the total population, compared to almost 50% in 1803. In terms of their status, only 146 of these Africans were free, and they represented a small fraction of the free black population. A total of 1,974 Africans, or 93%, were still enslaved. They comprised 11% of the total enslaved population. In terms of gender, the Africans were almost evenly divided. There were 1,070 females and 1,050 males. In terms of the island-wide distribution, 825 Africans, or 86%, lived in the countryside on plantations, and 295 Africans, or 14%, lived in the towns. Next image. This gives you a sense of the composition of the Africans in the towns. There were a small number, only 295, or 14% of the total number of enslaved people, enslaved individuals who found in the towns. In terms of the distribution, most of them, 68%, were in Christiansted, and the remainder were in Frederiksted. Of the number of Africans in terms of status, 162 were enslaved, and 133 were free. And they were the ones who were in the towns, as you will see, were overwhelmingly female. 79%, almost 80%, as opposed to 63% male. Next one. On the plantations, 1,825 Africans lived. Of these, 812 individuals were enslaved. 984 of them were males, 54%, and 828, or 40, were female. I'm sorry, 828 were females, or 46%. 13 of the individuals on the plantations were free, 10 females and 3 males. Next. In terms of their distribution, I've shown that by quarter. And as you can see, the greatest concentration of Africans in 1841 was, as in 1804, Prince Quarter, where there were 463. And the next highest quarter was West End Quarter with 295. I also put a list of the properties where there were 20 or more Africans in terms of the number, the estates having the highest number. And I highlighted in red the properties that have the highest number of Africans overall. So we can see that Fountain and River, which are more or less at in that complex in the center of the island where we saw all the concentration in 1804, those had each over 40 Africans. Lower Bethlehem, which we know as Bethlehem today, had 45, and the St. Barron spot had 41. Others had 30 and 20 Africans. But the point is that they were reasonably widely distributed, even in 1841, although they tended to concentrate in certain areas. Next slide. In terms of their age structure, you can see, oops, can somebody do that? Walk into it. You would expect we're about 49 years of age. And of those, a large number were female. African women, according to this data, appear to have lived longer than African men. And within the slave population, Africans were living longer than Creoles. And Africans comprised an absolute majority of those over the age of 60. In terms of their religious affiliations, all but 36 of the 2,120 Africans belonged to an established church in 1841. Among themselves, the Africans preferred the Moravian church, which you can see is quite higher than any other church, except maybe the Catholic. And their membership in that church was proportionally higher than that of Creoles. By contrast, very few Africans belonged to the Lutheran Church, even though the Lutheran Church had made an effort in the 1790s and early 1800s to establish a mission and to convert Africans. More African males than females were drawn to the Roman Catholic Church. Do any of the family history researchers here want to conjecture why that may have been? No. Why would the African males be more inclined to the Catholic Church?
I would venture to say because they're bringing their religion kind of camouflage with what the Catholics. How can I put it? Like you have your Santeria or your am I right? Okay. They identified the saints. They named them after their African gods or beliefs to camouflage so that they can then practice what their belief was.
All right, now that's a reasonable response, and of course that was the case in the Catholic colonies in Puerto Rico and Cuba, in the French West Indies and so on. We know that there was syncretic relationship between the Catholic faith and the African religious traditions. But here, I think that maybe somebody else wanted to say something.
Yeah. Well, also have to do with the fact that, at this point, some establishment has been made between the older schools, which are basically the Irish and Scottish, which is also going to sit to the, Africans and their communication.
That could be that there was some relationship between the high level number of Irish overseers, but why would the men go and not the women? See, I think that's the caveat. Why do males tend to prefer this church and the females not so much? Now, we got to move on, but I'll take two other questions, and I can't answer this question, by the way. I
I was
can
just going to say maybe they might have been allowed to join a religious order.
and
Forgiveness.
what?
Forgiveness of sins.
Well, that could be. And it also may have to do, somebody in the back.
Yeah, just a guess. If they escaped to Puerto Rico being Catholic, they would be free. They get their freedom.
I don't know.
I think there are more
I think that, I think that's an interesting question. I think it's an interesting question. But my sense is, in terms of church preferences, and all the family history researchers know this, it has to do with attitudes toward paternalism. And people shift churches because of the ability to hide paternalism sometimes. And therefore, the issue may have been that, the Catholic Church was not so inclined, as we know from some of the records, to reveal the parentage of the male parentage of baptized children. But I don't, that's just a speculation too. At any rate, the fact is that African males did prefer the Catholic faith. And Africans comprise nearly half of all inhabitants not belonging to a church. As you can see, 36 Africans did not belong to a church. And that was a low number, but still it was much higher than the griots. Next. Marriages. We see by this information that 99 Africans were married. That's 5% of the total. A relatively small number, but much higher than that of the Creoles. Interestingly, the Africans were more inclined to marry than Creoles during the period of slavery. And I think one of the reasons for that is because marriage was a way of establishing themselves within communities. Because Africans, remember, were coming into new communities and were trying to gain identities and trying to gain relationships. And marriage was a way of establishing a bond. And the Africans had been severed from their bonds and their relationships when they were physically uprooted and brought into the new world. So maybe having institutionalized relationships was important to them, to protect those relationships and to maintain them. Only 9% or 5% of the total were married in 1841. However, I've said all that. Among the Africans, marriages were more common for Anglicans and extremely uncommon for Lutherans. Next one, please. Childbearing. The census records only allow meaningful comparison of enslaved women. 943 enslaved women had children. Of these, living children. Of these, there were 943 African women. Of these, 445 had a total of 1,111 children, or 47%, 2.5 children per woman. Those are compared with the Creoles. Now these findings are open to interpretation like the religious ones, but they do suggest that a smaller percentage of enslaved African women had children than enslaved Creole women. But that enslaved African childbearers individually bore more children than did their Creole counterparts. Next. The censuses measured behavior by 2 entry columns. One was called moral character, and reading the descriptions that are put under moral character are very revealing throughout the censuses. They were only done in the period of slavery, but the 1841 and 1846 has really some interesting and telling information under this heading. And the other specifying criminal punishments. In terms of their moral character and criminal activities, enslaved Africans were rated about the same as enslaved Creoles. Slightly less, they were slightly better if one would want to judge it that way. And I give some figures to support that. Occupation. The majority of Africans, 57%, worked in the cane fields. Field laborers, a total of 1,206, divided into 661 men and 545 women. 689 of these were attached to the big gang. Most of them were men. 517 of the field laborers were attached to the small gang, and most of them were older women. The ages of field laborers ranged from 31 to 83. The majority were over 55 years of age. 30 Africans over 70 years of age were still working in the fields. All but one of them on the small gang, which was assigned not to the heavy work of cutting and harvesting cane or planting cane, but to collecting cane, chopped cane or grass, removing grass, or taking care of animals or so on. A few men attached to the big gang few African men who attached to the big gang had specialized tasks. Nero of Cane Valley was the head sugar boiler. York of Fredensborg was a rum distiller. Kit of Butler's Bay was a gardener. But very few of them on the plantations had actual skilled trades. We can see that skilled trades, there were in the skilled trades 117 total men, mainly men, who some of them free on the most of them on the plantation. They included 35 masons, 33 carpenters, 31 coopers, blacksmiths, a saddler, a tailor in the town, and a painter in the towns. In terms of domestic and skilled trades, 206 total Africans were engaged in those trades, mostly enslaved women. 98 were house servants. 57 were classified as washers. 41 as cooks. And that's a relatively high number. Apparently, African cooking was valued by the population as a whole. 36 of these being women, but 5 men, and mostly in the towns. There were 5 nurses, 2 hostlers, 2 grooms, and 1 midwife, and 1 doctor, a man named Bonaparte, who was enslaved on LaGrange Estate outside of Frederickstead. There were no seamstresses, which is very interesting, because seamstresses was one of the major occupations of Creoles and other people, both primarily in the towns. We go to the next page. Other specialties, there are 51 Africans were engaged in other specialties. Most of them were hucksters in the towns, hucksters and sellers in both the towns. There were 8 fishermen, 1 fish fryer, 1 cigar maker, 4 bakers, a porter, 3 butchers, and butchery would become a very important occupation for Africans after emancipation. 1 barber, and 3 retailers or shopkeepers. So a few Africans in the towns had developed a place of business for themselves. They weren't mobile in terms of it, but they were actually selling out of their own homes or out of rented homes. Finally, there was a large group, 24% of all Africans, who were not working, as you would expect given the ages of the people involved. 506, these individuals were classified as unemployed in 1841 for reasons of infirmities, bad health, exhaustion, etc., brought on by long lives of strenuous labor, poor maintenance, and harsh punishment. They ranged in age from 26 to 100. And the oldest African was 100. But the majority was over 60 years of age. Nearly all of these unemployed people were enslaved. 83% lived on the plantations, and 61% were free females. Some were being supported by their owners, many by family relations, and some in the towns by charity, pensions as it was called, from the government or churches. Next. Now, after emancipation in 1848, the number of Africans on St. Croix began to decline rather dramatically. And you can see the decrease recorded in the figures on the screen. There were 1,443 on the eve of emancipation, less than 1,000 in 1850, 366 in 1860, 81 in 1817, 19 in 1880, and just 3 in 1890. And these figures, by the way, are corrected in terms of some of the information that I've been able to work out with revising the census records. By 1900, there were no Africans living on St. Croix. So the Africans had disappeared. At least 2 of the Africans in 1890 probably were actual recent immigrants. In terms of their distribution, I've chosen 1871 to make I think, a salient point, 1870 census. Of the 81 Africans recorded on St. Croix in 1870, 57 of them, or 70%, were clustered on the western end of the island in the following locations. And they were in the West End Quarter. A large number, a high percentage of them were in Frederiksted and in Prince Quarter, and a few on Northside A Quarter. And what this suggests is that one of the reasons that Frederiksted and the West End continues to be sort of a bastion of African heritage and African culture, and may reflect in this in a variety of ways. The last thing I want to do is talk about the last surviving African brought to St. Croix by the slave trade. I've talked about Africans as a group, as an ethnic group up to this point, using the census records. And I would just like to make the point that what I did with the census records, you all can do. I went to the census records and I didn't look to try to find an ancestor or an individual. I went to locate a particular social group. You can do that using the St. Croix African database fairly quickly. The database is located at Wynn Museum. Hopefully there will be another set of it in the public library in the near future. But you can go there and click very easily on any census and ask, for instance, who was born in Denmark. And all the people who were Danes will pop up right in your eyes, just like that. And you can go through every census and do that. And you can find out the names of the Danes right away. If you want to find out the names of, or the identities of the information about people from other Caribbean islands, you can do that, particularly after the 1850s, when immigrants began coming into St. Croix. So you can look not only at their nationality, their ethnic backgrounds, but you can look at their occupations. You can go in and click on the census record and you can find out who were all the Masons and what their ages were and where they were located, and who they were living with. So that kind of social history, I urge some of you to do. And I was asked earlier by somebody, what can students do to inform themselves about the people who lived on St. Croix during the Danish period? And that's something you can do. Students could go very easily and say, well, I want to do a research paper on the Masons, or the seamstresses, or the hucksters on St. Croix, or in Christiansted, or whatever. And you can do that very, very quickly using the database. So I want to urge more of you, these beyond the family history researchers, to think about using the database for social, doing better social history. What I did, however, is try to use the censuses to determine who was the last surviving African brought by the slave trade on St. Croix. Now, in doing that, I was looking not only for the people who arrived before 1803, because that is what we normally think about is when the slave trade ended. But we know from documentation that enslaved Africans were being brought into St. Croix as late as 1820s, who had been brought over by the slave trade in one way or the other, some of whom were being taken through St. Thomas, where slavers could go up until the 1840s, as long as they didn't, quote, unload people from the ships. Well, of course they did. And so what happened is that Africans were finding their way into St. Croix up until the 1830s or 40s from various areas, either in the Caribbean or possibly from elsewhere. We know further that when immigration from the Eastern Caribbean begins in the 1860s and 70s, a fair number of Africans came because those islands, the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, had begun importing Africans to complete their workforces. So they were already bringing Africans into the Caribbean that way. And there were also some Africans that belonged to the so-called West Indian regiments that were stationed on a number of the Caribbean islands. And those people began moving around the Caribbean. So Africans came into St. Croix after 1860 as immigrants. But those are not people I was interested in. I was interested in people who would have been brought by the slave trade more or less prior to about 1820, 1830. In doing that, I went to the 1890 census as my first, because that's the last census where we have Africans, to see what I could find out about the three people who were identified on that census. Now the problem with that is that the census is incomplete. We probably only have half, maybe a little more than half of that census. So all of the enslaved, all of the Africans who would have been here are not identified on the census. Second problem is that we have some gaps, serious gaps in the church records and the vital statistic records for the 1890s. So when an African would die and would be identified as such in the death records, we just don't have a complete set of death records for that period. So we miss that. Moreover, starting in the 1870s, we know that, or I know, maybe other people know, that people were no longer identifying Africans as such. When they died or when they were married or whatever, there was just not an identification process going on. So Africans were not only disappearing, but their identity was being lost for one reason or another. The 1890 lists two possible Africans living on St. Croix. The first was Giuliana Prince, 35 years of age, a field laborer living on estate Constitution Hill with her husband, Urson William Prince. According to the census, she immigrated to St. Croix in 1865. The second African, and there was actually a third African, but that was one that I found by checking all kinds of records And even now I raise a question about whether he was an African or not. But he was a man by the name of Thomas Christopher, who is said to have arrived in the 1840s from Trinidad. If he was an African, he came from another island and probably was consistently recorded as an African in 7 of the 9 censuses taken between 1841 and 1890. She was also listed as an African in her death record of May 5th, 1892. She was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church, but no birth record has been found for her. According to Judge Carl Sauer of Frederiksted, a rather reliable authority, most of us have found out, and most census records, she was born circa 1880 and enslaved around that time on estate Rouen in West End Quarter, which Rouen is located near Good Hope, State Good Hope, on the shoreline. She is listed in the 1841 census as Bess, 33 years old, an African, Roman Catholic, unmarried, a field laborer in the big game. She had 2 living children, who other records identify as Benjamin James, born in 1838, Simon James in 1840, and she had a 3rd child, Lydia James, who was born in 1845. Bess was freed on estate Rouen in July 1848 as part of the general emancipation. At that time, she was living with Jim James, an African man, 40 years of age, working as a cooper on estate Rouen. He had undoubtedly fathered all of her children with the James surname. They would be married in 1853. In 1852, Bess moved with her family from estate Rouen to estate Kane, nearby, where she was employed as a field laborer and Jim as a cooper and mason. In 1856, this family moved to Wynn, where she would remain until Jim died in 1859. In 1863, Bess moved with her daughter, Lydia, from estate Good Hope to Prince Street, 75 in Frederiksted, which she and Jim had purchased prior to his death. It was in both of their names. She lived there, supporting herself by rental income until she died on May 5th, 1892. She was buried on estate Good Hope. And it's very interesting because I've done some work for Landmark Society on people who came from estate Good Hope, which, as you know, is where Good Hope School is located. And many of them, even though they migrated out of Good Hope and made their way to Frederiksted, all seem to have been buried back on Good Hope. There is a major burial ground there that we don't know about, but we all have to be concerned about, I think, because it was very sacred ground to a lot of people, I think. Imagine, I mean, it's about 6 or 7 miles from Frederiksted, but these people apparently felt it was necessary to have their bodies transferred back to this ancestral ground and buried there. While Bess appears to have been too young to have been brought to St. Croix prior to the ending of the slave trade in 1803, she no doubt was brought into St. Croix legally or illegally during the British occupation. For the time being, she appears to have claimed to be the last survivor on St. Croix of that horrific commerce. By the 1890s, slave trade Africans had disappeared completely from St. Croix. That some had managed to live that long in the terrible conditions prevailing for working people on the island before and after slavery, that was a testament to their strength, fortitude, resiliency, and the cultural survival that they helped forge on the island. And at this point, I thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to have questions.